Intro. When it comes to city design, it always feels like there's a different philosophy to it compared to what's efficient for building a city. There's a lot about some cities, mainly in the United States, that feel like they could have been made more for the people and less for the car. There's some improvements that could be made for basically all types of cities, but the main ones are the big towns like Houston, for example, that could use these big cities that people live in, but only have to rely on getting there by car, which could sometimes, be a pain with that many people there. This also goes down to like suburbia, down to like different levels of where people live, where they're next to the big cities overall, but are in between them and being rural, so they're like in the middle. But it also stretches down to the rural areas as well, that everyone basically kind of forgets about. But we should talk about every structure of cities that have been built and how they could all basically be fixed in a way that lets people have more freedom when walking around it or traveling around the city, basically making it more for the person and less for like the car. When you picture a big city, you also picture a lot of people living in the city, and that city having a lot of big buildings like skyscrapers and all these job creation places. They're like giving people jobs and all that. That's why people go there. You know the types of buildings I'm talking about. They're mainly in the skyline of these cities. Whenever you look at them on like Google Images, these buildings make up the skyline and are usually close to one another. If we take New York City, for example, we can basically see that there are all these tall buildings in all five boroughs of the city, basically, but they're mainly in Manhattan and are very dense in that part of the city. And this is because of how this part is more business oriented, and so, there kind of has to be these towers full of people and full of productivity. A lot of people usually make up this part of the city because they need to get stuff done. It's basically like, oh, I have to do my job and make sure the city runs. But on a more U.S. city vague scale, there are these big business locations in cities that are important, like Austin or Boston or LA. These cities that have a very dense population and the skylines, like of the big buildings, all the cities have that, actually give off the vibe of a big city where everyone lives. Some of these cities, like the big ones, have public transportation, like the MTA for New York, where it has trains and buses to get around the city. This is mainly because of how dense and populated New York City is. They kind of need it, basically, to function as a city. People live near their jobs, and they can't really drive. So since these cities are like that, there's the subway system that basically kind of connects the five boroughs of New York City together and making it easier for people to not need a car. That's why New York has like a high ridership for the MTA compared to most other cities, because it's centered around it. You've seen those movies with how they drive in New York. Like, no wonder people take the MTA overall. It's just worth it. And that also helps the city make a lot of more money in a way, since it's more efficient than having over 1 million people driving basically everywhere. Now, when we look at all the cities that are dedicated to cars and have little to no public transportation, like Austin or Houston, and Detroit, but better yet, let's just look at any big Texas city, except for really Dallas, since we all know it's no secret. They kind of have a little bit there. There's not a lot of public transportation in these cities, and so if you go in there and you either are walking far distances or you're probably parking in a parking garage. Let's be honest, that's the best you can do. The tall buildings that have a lot of floors and a lot of cars, and they're basically like 9 stories tall for no reason. This is always a hassle, no matter what state you're in, because nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to willingly be in a parking garage. You try to get out of there as fast as you can, usually, because you don't trust it. It's not a trustworthy place to park your car. But it does bring up the question of what to do with parking spaces, because there's still a need for them, but we shouldn't have so many parking spaces because we have more than we have people. There's too many for these big cities where literally anything else could go instead. Literally anything else could be used instead of having 800 parking spots, because it isn't really efficient to have that many. So the first fix that we can do is making sure less people have to drive. And this can be done with things like public transportation, like trains and buses, like the MTA as mentioned before. These easily make it so that less cars are required to drive everywhere, so more people, if they are centered in the city, can have options. This would, of course, cost a lot of money and time to develop a train station and route, because that's underground stuff. And also, Rome wasn't built in a day and all that stuff. It's something that would be worth it once it's finished. It pays off in the end. But there's multiple big points in each city. So those would be the big stations. Probably near where the parking garages are, since, that's where the most parking spots are for people going into the city. Now, we can take a look at the MBTA, for example, because if you've ever played Fallout 4, you can see the Alewife train station, which is how some people use the train stations, where they aren't in the direct city, but they're on the outskirts of it, basically, on the outer red line. Because the way something like the MBTA works is you have these tips in these somewhat busy cities that people get into, they get onto, and they ride into the financial districts of the big cities. So where all the big buildings are and the big money, they go from the outskirts to there. This makes it easier for more people to get in without really having so much traffic, because if you have a good subway system, you have efficient trains that are on time. They're not late if it's good, because that's efficiency, and efficiency means being on time. This logic can also be applied easily to other big cities that are important to the economy of the US, or whatever country doesn't have these public transportations, since it makes it more efficient to have better transportation for people. So what should be done to do this in the major cities to get them to be this is a few simple, easy steps. And the first one is kind of identifying where the busy spots are for people and build the big stations in those places. The ones with commuters, the subway lines, basically being people go there often. This is because of how these stations will hold a lot of people and will connect people to more places easier, so they can get into the city from another city like a suburb, or even some rural town in the middle of nowhere, and can go to these different parts of the city without needing to do an hour-long drive or something. These stations are big and usually hold a lot of different lines, as most stations usually hold one line, maybe two if you're lucky. These can be the ones that bring people to different places from the big stations or anything like that. The people will be able to get off at any station and walk from place to place. So it would really work if implemented well like good. It has to be implemented good since it's semi-expensive depending on what the prices are, but these could connect a lot more people together. So more people can easily have like social places to go, which it's a good thing because we need some of those. We all know what suburbia is because it's been mentioned in media like American Idiot by Green Day, where people don't live in the city, but they don't live in the rural backbone nowhere areas. These are like the suburban moms and families where people have the backyards, but not too big, and they usually have a driveway. The stereotypical white picket fence house that you basically kind of imagine when you think about the American dream and like, oh, I want to own a house. These have their importance, but they also aren't those financial hubs or business centric places like the big cities are. They're just mainly on the outskirts. So these would be those connecting stations if close to the city they're traveling to, or just anywhere in a close proximity to a big city. There's a lot of suburbia areas that aren't near a big town, or if they are, they're too far away to actually build a line that connects to a subway station of the main city. But for this part, we can talk about both and kind of how to fix both. First up would be the city type that is next to the big city and has a big population, yet is still suburbia in a way, where you have the backyards and the houses, and you have the white picket fence foundation of people own their home, they own their property. Usually, these cities are just grouped in with the big city when people think about them, but also in terms of their population. It's just because they overall add to the city in a way, which kind of helps it, and it's hard to unblur the lines between when it stops and starts. So these cities usually have some of the same lines as the big cities, but of course, they don't have the full 9 yards of the subway station yet because they don't have that big of a population compared to the big city. If you look at the previously mentioned Alewife station, this can be an example of how to do suburban or out there cities that connect near a city, because it basically extends the subway out a little bit just to the nearby areas. Picture it like a spider web, where you have the center of it where all the string is and it's weaved in the concise pattern that is like more dense in the middle. But the more outside the middle you get, the less connections there are, but there are still connecting places. That would act as a connecting place. The outer edges that aren't too far away and still can be efficient to act on the normal subway platform and not need a whole commuter rail, essentially. Now, these do work and can get the job done, but it doesn't cover every suburbia town around, since sometimes there's just some stragglers. The ones that don't fit the big population method, but have a larger size than the rural towns. These are the medium-sized cities that just are kind of places you know in your nearby area, but nobody outside the county really knows. Most places have them, but these are the cities that have 1 or 2 stations on like the commuter lines that connect to the big city, really. That's really all these cities are dedicated to. The long commuter lines that connect to larger cities but take a while. They don't have too many stations, but they have some things to do. It's a drivable suburbia town. They exist, but the population depends on the state, since a state like Texas, really, is a lot larger, and I mean a lot larger than a state like New Jersey. And it's also more populated, but less dense. So they'll have more suburbia towns, and those towns will probably have a larger population, but they'll be scattered everywhere, basically. The way this can be dealt with is in a similar fashion to the other towns that are in this nature, where they are connected, but they aren't connected to a lot. They have a few stations for subways or buses, but these are mainly the smaller systems since they don't need to be all fancy and stuff. They just need to get people to the places where they have to be, and in this cases of towns that can't really build all that stuff, buses are usually a better option because people can then get around for cheaper than having to fill up their car, and because we know how expensive that is. This can also allow more lines throughout these cities, no matter how they would decide to do that, because some places do it different than the other cities with how buses drive around. Buses also act as trains since they are still public transportation, and also they bring more people everywhere in a more efficient manner compared to things like cars where it takes so much space just to be able to get one person somewhere, because it takes like half a trolley, even more, to get one person around. This makes the roads more safe if you have buses, but also what has been happening is more cities and stuff, at least where I am, they've been building like rail trails where they go around the city and stuff, but you get around by walking or biking, which is actually good. It would actually help people to get around to these spots that the buses and other transportation methods don't cover as much. And also, it's a nice exercise for the people who do decide to use it, because not everyone has to use it, but it's just there for options. The only problem with it is that it sometimes isn't the best. You know, if it's raining or it's snowing, whenever it does do that, because it's never salted or prepared for those scenarios. But it usually works just fine for the rest, since it's paved land or stoned land that is mainly solid, but it's able to do the job to get people places. It just requires more time and like a little bit more effort to get to those places. There are many ways to get people from one place to another in a suburbia style that could be adapted by more cities, but there would need to be a lot of incentive for that stuff and a lot of money. And I mean a whole lot to invest in this. There's more that could be done, but it is important to note that it is not, and I mean not impossible, to make cities that aren't big cities walkable. It's just more difficult because it's a rarer sight to see, especially in the US, compared to the big city public transportation that they can afford to do and build over all these years. But there is also more options that could be done than thought about, because there is more space and there has to be more distance covered because of that more space, which also kind of presents a challenge for some of the suburbia towns. But that challenge can be overcome by having a good design for the city and the transportation systems. But the more space part really just applies to like rural areas more than suburbia towns. Now, rural areas are where the least amount of people live compared to all three categories, because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. Most of them are. This is where the idea of like just living in the forest just happens, because every town is in the same type of biome, the weird one. Like, they can be in forests or deserts or somewhere. Mainly these towns are only sometimes highway towns, if that. It's mainly like a side highway. But you rarely even see them be that. They're mainly backroads towns where the only way to get to them is by like the back roads. You have to take an exit, you have to take the back roads, which is like really hard to find. Find on a map or two, you can't, because they're impossible. You don't know about them. They don't like care about like as compared to suburban areas, because there's nothing in rural towns, and like people kind of forget about them. They kind of are like, well, it's a rural town, okay. That's what people always say, But there are people in the towns that live and have lives, but it's just more disconnected usually. There is stuff to do, but it's harder to get to and usually requires something like a car where you need to drive to get to the supermarket. You need to drive to see your friends. You need to drive to do everything, since everything is 150% away from each other, at least by a quarter of a mile, it feels like in most of these towns. But maybe you have like a small neighborhood that's not like that. This would require the most, and I mean the most, of the plan, if anybody were to do this, to make it more for the people, because it would like cover so much space, but also it would require the least amount of effort to fix, as there is barely any public transportation in these towns, so you don't have to worry about fixing a bus. Oh, a bad bus route or a bad train route. No, you can just start from scratch basically. But there also doesn't need to be that much added in the first place, because you don't have that much. You have to cover more space, but you also don't have to add as much, which is kind of like it equals out in the end. So we wouldn't need trains, since nobody would take them, let's be honest, but would people take buses if they were available? More likely, as compared to a train, which wouldn't have anybody on it. So buses would be one of the things that could be added, because like people already drive everywhere and there's not that much dense stuff. That could happen, and the rail trails, as mentioned before, could also happen, because rail trails sometimes connect the rural part of suburban areas to the cities, which help people get out there. The same could be applied for rural areas, except rural rail trails would have to be designed differently. This is because they have to get more houses and be close to houses, even if they are very far away from civilization, or any street for that matter. They still have to be in a walkable distance of the rail trail if they wanted to like take advantage of it. It varies city to city, of course, so again, that would require a really good design for them, like by people, like most other things. But usually these can connect to suburban areas, because most of the time they're near some sort of larger town-esque. You never really see a lot. Like, I mean, you see it sometimes, but you never see a lot of, oh, it's just rural land for everywhere. You don't see that unless you're in like Wyoming or like Montana, the big states. But that larger town that they're connected to acts as something that the people of the rural town can sometimes rely on, really, just because of things like grocery stores and stuff. When there's more people, there's more things to do. And so that's why big cities thrive like they do. Rural areas have some people, but they don't have the things to do like Suburbia does and the big cities have. So they still need to be connected to that nearby area. But there's a lot of ways to do that, but it depends on what would be best. But rural areas are also important, as they usually have the farms and the different things that produce food or essentials for people to live. So they also need to have land that's untapped in that way. So there's no way to alter those parts of the city, because it's important for the city to survive. So it just kind of makes you wonder, like, what can you do in that situation overall? But it would depend on the people of the city, really. Overall, when it comes to American cities, there is a lot that can be done with how we actually have the infrastructure built. Of course, this isn't an overnight change anywhere, but it's an idea on how to improve things on every scale of where people live, because it shouldn't be just the big cities getting the love and attention for infrastructure and having things like transportation. Rural and suburbia areas matter a lot. and have so many people in them that it would basically wouldn't be it would be practically impossible to leave them out of it. So it's important to have these projects actually be affecting everyone if they were to come into effect. Though it may be wishful thinking considering our infrastructure is not getting any updates soon. But it's always nice to think about it because it's fun and it's like hopeful. Because it does matter to a lot of people that the cities get improved and they can actually get more places to be better and more social. While like some towns are kind of like becoming ghost towns, like Rust Belt and stuff like that. And we definitely know that we need more sociability everywhere. It'd be nice to have places to go that are easy to get to, and that's really the idea behind city design, and specifically the ways of transporting people around. But that's really about it. If you have your own thoughts, you could leave them down below, comment them down below if you want, and share them. But if you want to, you could like and subscribe. Pretty please.